Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Yang terhormat Ketua BPK RI, Bapak Dr. Agung Firman Sampurna CSFA, Ketua Mahkamah Agung RI, Bapak Profesor Dr. Haji Muhammad Syarifuddin SH.MH, Gubernur Bank Indonesia Bapak Peri Warjio, His Excellencies the Ambassador of United Arab Emirates Mr. Abdullah Salem Al-Daheri, yang kami hormati Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika Bapak Joni G. Plate, Menteri Koperasi dan UKM Bapak Teten Mas Duki, Ketua Komisi 11 DPR RI, pimpinan lembaga negara, lembaga pemerintahan, dan Kementerian Kabinet Indonesia Maju, anggota Dewan Gubernur, serta Bapak dan Ibu hadirin sekalian yang bergabung secara luring maupun daring melalui Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, dan Instagram Bank Indonesia. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang di acara Peluncuran Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Peluncuran ini merupakan agenda tahunan Bank Indonesia untuk memperkuat transparansi dan akuntabilitas sebagaimana diamanatkan di dalam Undang-Undang tentang Bank Indonesia. Baiklah Bapak Ibu, mengawali acara pagi ini, izinkan kami mengajak Bapak Ibu untuk sejenak berdoa kepada Yang Maha Kuasa, seraya memohon ridhonya agar acara hari ini dapat berjalan lancar serta memberi manfaat bagi kemajuan bangsa. Doa akan dipimpin oleh Imam Besar Masjid Istiqlal Jakarta. Kepada Profesor Kiai Haji Nasaruddin Umar, kami silakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Izinkan saya memimpin doa secara agama Islam yang lain dimohon menyesuaikan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Hamdas syakirin, hamdan na'imin, hamdan yuwafi ni'amahu wa yukafi'u mazidah. Ya Rabbana lakal hamdu kama yanbaghi li jalali wajhikal karim wa azimi sultanik. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina wa habibina wa syafi'ina maulana Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ya Allah, ya Hamid, ya Syakur, puji syukur kami panjatkan kehadirat-Mu, karena atas segala rahmat dan karunia-Mu lah, maka pagi hari ini kami bisa menyelenggarakan acara peluncuran laporan transparansi dan akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia tahun 2021. Tiada lain harapan kami semuanya kecuali memohon ridha dan berkah-Mu, agar acara ini menjadi salah satu momentum untuk memulihkan kembali perekonomian bangsa kami. Ya Allah, Ya Alim, Ya Khabir, berikanlah kami kesadaran untuk bisa memahami dan menghayati arti luhur kehidupan ini, sehingga kami bisa bekerja dengan penuh ketulusan dan keikhlasan. Jadikanlah segenap aktivitas keseharian kami sebagai ibadah di sisi-Mu. Berikanlah kemampuan dan kemudahan bagi kami semua, agar bisa melewati dengan baik berbagai tantangan dan ujian yang kami hadapi. Kami sungguh sangat yakin, sebesar apapun tantangan dan ujian, pasti kami bisa melewatinya dengan baik jika Engkau selalu hadir mendampingi kami. Jadikanlah bangsa kami sebagai bangsa yang terhormat dan bermartabat di balik maraknya tantangan yang kami hadapi. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, anugerahkanlah hidayah-Mu kepada kami semuanya, agar pertemuan penting ini bisa melahirkan pikiran-pikiran cerdas untuk memulihkan perekonomian bangsa kami. Sehingga dan semoga pertemuan ini menjadi wasilah untuk lahirnya sinergi dan inovasi guna menyelesaikan berbagai persoalan bangsa kami. Kami yakin dengan sifat-Mu yang Maha Pemberi kekuatan dan pemberi petunjuk, Al-Qawi, Al-Hadi, maka bangsa kami akan kokoh dan tangguh menghadapi berbagai tantangan. Karena itu kami mohon kepadamu ya Allah, ya Tuhan kami, berikanlah semangat, kekuatan, dan keikhlasan untuk berkolaborasi secara internal dan berkompetisi secara eksternal guna mewujudkan bangsa kami sebagai bangsa yang lebih maju dan penuh berkah. Ya Allah, ya Ghafur, ampunilah dosa-dosa kami. Bimbinglah kami dan tampakkanlah kebenaran kepada kami semua, bahwa yang benar itu benar, dan berikan kekuatan untuk menjalani kebenaran itu. Tunjukkan pula kepada kami yang batil itu batil, berikan pula kekuatan untuk meninggalkan kebatilan itu. Ya Allah, hanya kepadamu lah kami menyerahkan segala urusan kami. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzabannar wa adkhilna jannata ma'al abrar ya aziz ya ghafar ya rabbal alamin. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa habibina wa syafi'ina maulana Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Amin, amin, amin ya rabbal alamin. Bapak Ibu yang berbahagia, mengantar peluncuran Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Marilah kita saksikan bersama persembahan tarian yang mencerminkan kekuatan sinergi dari berbagai pihak dalam satu semangat dan sikap optimis untuk meraih kegemilangan bersama. Sinergi disimbolkan dalam warna-warni kain yang dikenakan, didukung dengan semangat optimisme yang dihadirkan melalui musik dan gerakan yang rancak dan penuh energi. Bapak Ibu sekalian, mari kita saksikan bersama tari kreasi Zapin Nusantara. Persembahan tari kreasi Zapin Nusantara. Terima kasih para penari. Bapak Ibu hadirin yang kami hormati, segera kita masuki puncak acara pagi ini, yaitu sambutan yang akan dirangkai dengan prosesi peluncuran Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Sambutan akan disampaikan oleh Gubernur Bank Indonesia. Kepada yang terhormat Bapak Gubernur, kami persilakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semuanya. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Your Excellency, Your Majesty Abdullah Salim Adabe, Ambassador of United Arab Emirates to Indonesia. Yang mulia, Ketua Mahkamah Agung, Bapak Syarifuddin, yang hadir secara virtual. Yang kami hormati, Ketua Badan Pemeriksa Keuangan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Agung Firman Sampurna. Ketua Komisi 11 DPR RI, Bapak Dito Kanidito, beserta seluruh pimpinan dan anggota Komisi 11 yang juga hadir. Antara lain Bapak Amir Usara, Menteri Koperasi dan UMKM, sahabat saya Bapak Teten Mas Duki, seluruh Dewan Gubernur Bank Indonesia, Dewan Komisioner OJK, Dewan Komisioner LPS, para pimpinan perbankan, dan juga para wakil menteri, Pak Tiko, Pak Iskandar, dan tentu saja sahabat-sahabat mitra-mitra Bank Indonesia yang hadir dalam acara ini secara tatap muka maupun secara daring. Selamat datang. Selamat datang dalam acara yang sangat penting ini, yaitu peluncuran Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia. Puji syukur, marilah kita panjatkan kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Tuhan yang Maha Kuasa, atas rahmat-Nya yang begitu banyak. Tidak mungkin kita bisa menghitungnya. Terima kasih kepada Bapak-Bapak Ibu yang berkenan hadir dalam acara ini, baik secara tatap muka maupun secara daring. Acara inilah wujud nyata dari Bank Indonesia, yaitu adalah memperkuat tata kelola Bank Indonesia, transparansi dan akuntabilitas. Inilah pertama kali Bank Indonesia menyampaikan secara sekaligus di bulan Januari Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia. Tidak Kementerian Keuangan. Kawan-kawan perbankan, mari kita tingkatkan pembiayaan dan kredit kepada perbankan. Prediksi kami bisa sampai 7-9%. Bahkan Pak Yahya menyampaikan kepada saya, Pak Darmanti menyampaikan saya, bisa lebih tinggi Pak. Alhamdulillah, terima kasih. Tentu saja Pak Tiko akan sangat mendukung untuk itu. Mari kita tingkatkan kredit dan pembiayaan untuk pemulihan ekonomi usaha. Dan disitulah kekuatan dari sinergi kita. Sinergi kebijakan ekonomi nasional. Satu prasyarat yaitu vaksinasi. Terima kasih pada pemerintah yang sangat cepat. Insya Allah sebentar lagi booster. Pembukaan sektor ekonomi, stimulus fiskal dan moneter, pembiayaan, dan juga terus reformasi di sektor real dan juga di sektor keuangan. Tentu saja Pak Teten, mari kita terus UMKM kita gerakkan, inklusi ekonomi. Dan tentu saja para asosiasi sistem pembayaran, digitalisasi menjadi kunci untuk itu. Bank Indonesia terus berkomitmen bersama pemerintah, KSSK dan berbagai pihak memperkuat sinergi untuk pemulihan ekonomi. Insya Allah tahun 2022 akan lebih. Mari kita optimis, mari kita bersinergi. Bank Indonesia 5 instrumen akan kami arahkan untuk itu. Kebijakan moneter memang akan kami lebih arahkan untuk stabilitas, menjaga inflasi, dan tentu saja stabilitas nilai tukar karena tekanan global yang meningkat. Tapi 4 kebijakan lain, makrobudensial, sistem pembayaran, pendalaman pasar, inklusi ekonomi keuangan dan ekonomi hijau, dan juga kebijakan internasional kami terus akan sampaikan dan kita dorong bersinergi dengan pemerintah untuk mendorong pemulihan ekonomi. Itulah pesan yang pertama. Mari kita bangkitkan optimisme di tahun 2022 akan lebih baik. Marilah kita terus bersinergi untuk bersama mengangkat ekonomi kita segera pulih menuju Indonesia maju. Pesan yang pertama. Pesan yang kedua yang kami sampaikan dalam laporan tahunan Bank Indonesia. Tidak hanya kami menyampaikan laporan pelaksanaan tugas di tahun 2021 dan rencana 2022, tapi kami sampaikan dalam laporan tahunan ini adalah transformasi yang kami lakukan secara besar-besaran sejak tahun 2018. Transformasi kebijakan, bauran kebijakan kami perkuat. Transformasi organisasi dengan re-engineering business process, reorganisasi, lebih efektif, lebih cepat. Lebih dari itu kami juga melakukan transformasi di bidang sumber daya manusia. Knowledge, learning, budaya kerja. Dan lebih jauh itu transformasi digital. Visi kami adalah menjadi bank sentral digital terdepan yang berkontribusi nyata terhadap perekonomian nasional dan terbaik di emerging market menuju Indonesia maju. Itulah pesan kedua dalam laporan tahunan Bank Indonesia yang tentu saja kan secara resmi juga akan kami sampaikan kepada Pak Agung, BPK dan Pak Dito, Komisi 11 sebagai bentuk transparansi dan akuntabilitas kami. Itulah pesan yang kedua, komitmen Bank Indonesia terus melakukan transformasi di berbagai bidang, kebijakan, organisasi, sumber daya manusia, dan tentu saja digitalisasi untuk mempersiapkan era baru, era digital. Itu yang kedua. Pesan yang ketiga adalah dukungan kami untuk bersama pemerintah dan berbagai pihak membangun ekonomi yang tentu saja adalah inklusi. Dan sesuai dengan masyarakat Indonesia, termasuk ekonomi dan keuangan syariah. Dukungan kami sangat penuh dari pusat dan berbagai daerah, 46 kantor di seluruh Indonesia dan luar negeri untuk mendukung pemerintah, Pak Teten, Pak Luhut, untuk bagaimana UMKM menjadi daya dukung ekonomi. Kami lakukan digitalisasi untuk mendukung itu. Dan lebih dari situ adalah juga dukungan untuk ekonomi keuangan syariah. Inilah pesan yang ketiga yang kami sampaikan. Yang untuk ekonomi keuangan syariah kami sampaikan laporan ekonomi keuangan syariah Indonesia yang kami terbitkan lebih awal sebagai bentuk dukungan kami terhadap ini. Bapak-bapak, Ibu sekalian, itulah 3 pesan yang ingin kami sampaikan dari 3 laporan ini. Sebelum kami menutup, mari kita perkuat kebangkitan dan optimisme ekonomi kita. Mari kita kuatkan sinergi, mari kita kuatkan inovasi. Dan itulah, marilah kita sukseskan G20 di tahun 2022 ini. 6 agenda penting kita akan tentu saja sukseskan di jalur keuangan. Koordinasi di bidang normalisasi kebijakan. Mengatasi berbagai permasalahan dalam sektor keuangan. mendukung korporasi, digitalisasi sistem pembayaran, ekonomi keuangan inklusif dan hijau, dan tentu saja berbagai aspek mengenai perpajakan internasional. Bapak Presiden mengarahkan kepada kita dan Bu Menteri Keuangan bersama saya terus akan mendukung itu. Mari kita sukseskan G20 tidak hanya di bidang kesukseskan penyelenggaraan meetingnya saja. Tetapi mari kita bersama gunakan G20 ini untuk kita bangkit optimis untuk bersama showcasing kemajuan ekonomi Indonesia. Memperkuat perdagangan dan investasi secara global. Untuk itu kami akan mengajak seluruh Bapak Ibu sekalian, mari bersama pemerintah, bersama Bank Indonesia mensukseskan G20, terutama juga termasuk side meeting. Untuk jalur keuangan, insya Allah 15 dan 19 Februari, kita akan mengadakan pertemuan pertama di tingkat Menteri dan Gubernur Bank Indonesia. Selama 4 hari ada meeting, tapi selama 5 hari Pak Tiko, kita lakukan side meeting. Kami ajak seluruh kawan-kawan kementerian lembaga, perbankan, sektor keuangan, dunia usaha, UMKM, ekonomi keuangan syariah. Mari kita selenggarakan side meeting yang tentu saja Bank Indonesia bersama Menteri Keuangan sangat bangga untuk berpartisipasi dan mengajak Bapak-Bapak, Ibu sekalian. Bapak-Bapak, Ibu sekalian, itulah kata pengantar kami. Dan tentu saja dengan memohon hidayah petunjuk dan rahmat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Dengan bangga kami luncurkan laporan perekonomian Indonesia, laporan tahunan Bank Indonesia, dan laporan ekonomi keuangan syariah Indonesia tahun 2021. Semoga ini menjadi kontribusi nyata Bank Indonesia terhadap bangsa, negara, dan masyarakat. Sekian, terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Silakan Bapak untuk meluncurkan dengan
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Kita berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah atas peluncuran laporan transparansi dan akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Dan kami mohon perkenan Bapak Gubernur untuk tetap berada di panggung. Kami juga mengundang dengan hormat untuk naik ke atas panggung Ketua BPK RI, His Excellencies the Ambassador of United Arab Emirates, Menteri Koperasi dan UKM, serta Ketua Komisi 11 DPR RI. Selanjutnya kami mohon kesediaan Bapak Gubernur untuk berkenan menyerahkan secara simbolis ketiga buku laporan transparansi dan akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Penyerahan buku laporan tahunan Bank Indonesia, laporan perekonomian Indonesia, dan laporan ekonomi dan keuangan syariah 2021 selain merupakan bentuk transparansi dan akuntabilitas, juga merupakan wujud sinergi yang erat antar otoritas untuk menopang stabilitas ekonomi dan mendukung pertumbuhan. Kita berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah. Sekali lagi terakhir untuk Ketua Komisi 11 DPR RI. Selanjutnya kami mohon berkenan untuk Bapak Gubernur berkenan berdiri di tengah dan berfoto bersama dengan seluruh Bapak-Bapak yang ada di atas panggung. Baik, terima kasih Bapak-Bapak sekalian. Kami silakan untuk berkenan kembali ke tempat. Baiklah Bapak Ibu yang kami muliakan, untuk mengetahui lebih jauh mengenai Laporan Transparansi dan Akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021, mari kita saksikan bersama tayangan berikut ini.
Bank Indonesia meluncurkan publikasi 3 laporan sekaligus sebagai wujud kuatnya transparansi dan akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia sebagai amanat Undang-Undang Bank Indonesia. Perekonomian 2021 terus menuju ke pemulihan, baik di global maupun domestik dari dampak pandemi COVID-19. Namun demikian, masih terdapat 7 hal penting yang perlu diwaspadai dan diantisipasi. Hal ini menimbulkan tantangan bagi perekonomian domestik sehingga tertahan pada triwulan 3 2021. Tetapi perekonomian domestik kembali meningkat pada triwulan 4 dan menunjukkan proses pemulihan. Ketahanan eksternal terjaga, rupiah terkendali didukung langkah stabilisasi Bank Indonesia. Stabilitas ekonomi pun terjaga. Perkembangan tersebut juga didukung oleh perekonomian syariah sektor unggulan dengan fokus penguatan pada halal food dan fashion. Perekonomian Indonesia diperkirakan meningkat lebih tinggi pada 2022. Bank Indonesia terus bersinergi dalam kebijakan ekonomi nasional. Untuk memperkuat pemulihan ekonomi nasional, terdapat 1 prasyarat dan 5 respons kebijakan. Bank Indonesia berkomitmen mengarahkan seluruh instrumen bauran kebijakan untuk menjaga stabilitas dan mendukung pemulihan ekonomi. Kebijakan moneter diarahkan pada stabilitas. Kebijakan makroprudensial longgar terus dipertahankan. Digitalisasi terus diperluas untuk akselerasi ekonomi keuangan digital, akselerasi pendalaman pasar uang, serta kebijakan pendukung Bank Indonesia lainnya. Bank Indonesia terus mendukung pengembangan ekonomi keuangan syariah untuk inklusi ekonomi dan keuangan, serta mendorong pemulihan bersama otoritas, kementerian, dan lembaga lainnya dalam wadah KNEKS maupun dengan stakeholder terkait lainnya. Secara internal di Bank Indonesia, pelaksanaan respons kebijakan dan transformasi, baik di kebijakan utama maupun kelembagaan, mendukung tercapainya kinerja unggul Bank Indonesia. Transformasi kebijakan melalui penguatan bauran kebijakan, transformasi organisasi dan proses kerja ditempuh untuk mewujudkan organisasi yang berkinerja unggul, berbasis kinerja efektif, efisien, dan bertata kelola selaras dengan arah strategis Bank Indonesia. Transformasi SDM dan budaya kerja untuk menciptakan SDM unggul, profesional, kompeten, berjiwa kepemimpinan, dan berakhlak mulia. Transformasi digital diwujudkan melalui implementasi digitalisasi secara menyeluruh, baik pada area kebijakan maupun kelembagaan, untuk menuju bank sentral digital terdepan. Secara konsisten berkontribusi nyata melalui program sosial Bank Indonesia. Predikat WTP atas LKTBI dipertahankan selama 18 tahun berturut-turut. Perolehan berbagai ISO, serta apresiasi internasional dan domestik. Bank Indonesia akan terus mendorong perekonomian nasional untuk bangkit dan optimis dengan sinergi dan inovasi menuju Indonesia maju yang semakin sejahtera.
Kita berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah untuk tayangan atas ketiga laporan transparansi dan akuntabilitas Bank Indonesia 2021. Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, melanjutkan kemeriahan acara pagi ini, segera akan kita masuki bersama G20 International Seminar Series dengan tema Safeguarding the Growth Momentum bersama 3 narasumber dan dipandu oleh moderator. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our next agenda, the G20 International Seminar Series, is about to begin. Please give a warmest welcome to our moderator, Ms. Kania Sutisna Winata. Pada Ibu Kania Sutisna Winata, kami persilakan untuk naik ke panggung. And the floor is yours.
Hello, very good morning to our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at the G20 International Seminar on Safeguarding the Growth Momentum, Rise and Be Optimistic, Synergy and Innovation for Economic Recovery. It is such a pleasure and honor for me to be here today. I'm Sutisna Winata, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. And at this point, I would also like to greet our distinguished guests, audiences joining us through Zoom or via Zoom, since this is a hybrid event. So I would also like to greet them and welcome them, and also thank you again for joining us in this very prestigious event. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know that the global economy is surviving the COVID-19 pandemic, it continues to recover in 2021 and persist in 2022, supported by higher vaccination rates, policy stimuli, and also a gradual recovery of business activities. Nevertheless, several issues and challenges require vigilance. Recent developments indicate that global inflationary pressures remain high and persistent, followed by an earlier monetary policy tightening cycle than previously planned. And this has led, of course, to continued uncertainties in global financial markets, thus restricting capital flows and also intensifying currency pressures in developing countries, including in Indonesia. Moreover, as we talk about the scarring effect of the pandemic on the corporate sector, for example, and also the looming risk that might disrupt the sustainability of economic recovery and also cause financial system instability. And these issues must be addressed properly. So as we saw, domestic economic growth is forecasted to accelerate in 2022. And the latest economic indicators released in December last year point to a faster recovery process, and this includes public mobility, retail sales, and also other indicators as well, such as perhaps consumer confidence indicators are also on the rise and recovering. So we believe that synergies and also innovations, especially in national economic policies, are the key in promoting economic recovery process and also maintaining stability. And the synergy to accelerate vaccination rates, these are also some of the important and significant developments strengthening the handling of COVID-19, to implement also mobility restrictions at various levels, and to open especially priority sectors. That has become a game changer, not only in controlling the spread of the Delta variant, but also in maintaining the momentum of economic recovery. So as the recovery is underway, ladies and gentlemen, as we saw, an increased demand has put pressure on inflation. Many economies have started normalization of the accommodative policy measures. This has been gradual, and we believe that policy normalization is taken by considering several preconditions, with main considerations remains on, of course, maintaining macroeconomic stability, including price stability and also financial stability. So to discuss more on these issues, we have joining us three prominent speakers. So at this point, I would also like to invite our first speaker to please join me on stage, Deputy Governor of Bank Indonesia, Mr. Dodi Budi Waluyo. Please welcome. Hello, good morning. Good morning, Pak Dodi. How are you? Hope you're keeping yourself healthy. Everything well?
Very well.
Very well. That's good to know. So just a quick background. I'd like to give a short introduction of our first speaker, Mr. Dodi Budi Waluyo. He's a Deputy Governor of Bank Indonesia for a 5-year term from 2018 to 2023. And he previously served as the Assistant Governor and Head of Economic and Monetary Policy Department from 2016. As of 2019, he also served as Deputy Commissioner of Indonesian Financial Services Authority, or OJK, for ex officio Bank Indonesia. And along his career, Dodi Budi Waluyo also held several important positions within the Central Bank of the Republic of Indonesia. And to highlight a few, don't be modest, Pak Budi, Pak Dodi, he was Head of Strategic Management and Governance Department and Head of Economic Monetary Policy Department. Mr. Dodi Budi Waluyo received his undergraduate education in Economic Science and Development Study of the University of Indonesia and obtained his Master of Business Administration and MBA degree in University of Colorado, USA. So moving on to our second speaker, who will now be joining us via Zoom, is Deputy Director General, International Finance Bureau at Ministry of Economy and Finance, Korea. Good morning, Mr. Byung-sik Jung.
Good morning.
Hello, Mr. Byung-sik. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you again and taking the time to join us for this morning event. So a brief introduction about Mr. Byung-sik. He served as a Deputy Director General. Before that, he has served at the Ministry of Economy and Finance since 1994 as a Deputy Director of Foreign Exchange, a Senior Deputy Director of Financial Cooperation Division, Director of International Tax Division, and Director of Trade Policy Division. And since August 2016, he served as Counselor for Finance and Economy at Korea Embassy in Japan and became the Deputy Director General, International Finance Bureau, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Korea since November 2022 until now. And Mr. Byung-sik received his Doctor of Judicial Science in Trade and Financial Laws from American University Washington College of Law in December 2008, and Master of Laws in Securities and Financial Regulation from Georgetown University Law Center in May 2007. Again, it's such an honor to have you with us. And last but not least, I would like to invite our last speaker on stage. He's present with us as well. He's Director and Cities Indonesia Economist, Mr. Helmi Arman. Please join us on stage, if you will. Hello, Pak Helmi. Good morning. Thank you again for joining us again. I'd like to give a short introduction of Mr. Helmi. Mr. Helmi Arman joined Citi Research in 2011 from Bank Danamon Indonesia, where he was the economist and bond market strategist from 2005 to 2008. And prior to that, he was an economist with Bahana Securities from 2004 to 2005, and before that, an economist for the ASEAN Secretariat. And Mr. Helmi Arman graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics from Universitas Indonesia and holds an MSc degree in international money and banking from the University of Birmingham, UK, and a Master of Financial Economics degree from Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, Belgium. Again, welcome, and thank you again for joining us. So we have two speakers with us on stage and one speaker joining us via Zoom. So let us start with a quick overview on our topic today, safeguarding the growth momentum. I'm sure each of our speakers have different perspectives on the issues ahead, but hopefully a unified commitment on how to address them. So let's start with Pak Dodi, if you will. So to boost national economic recovery and maintain stability, Bank Indonesia, along with the support of all the other stakeholders, has played a key role. And based on these last 2 years, can you tell us how has Bank Indonesia played a role in maintaining stability and also overall recovery process during these last 2 years, Pak Dodi?
Oh,
Thank
We
you.
have about 8 to 10 minutes. This is a very brief overview. I know you have slides that you've
Okay.
prepared as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kania, and also thank you for giving me the first chance to give the remarks. Good morning to everybody. I think first I will say that I totally agree what already mentioned by Governor Perry and also by Kania in the introduction that basically the global economy continues to recover with the remain uncertainty mostly in the financial market. At least I noticed in the last 2 years, starting with the pandemic, of at least a few challenges, I will say 4 or 5 challenges that's still on until now. Even we bring up as a part of the discussion in the G20. The first, of course, we are talking about the uneven distribution of the vaccine, which will result to some extent to the uneven of the recovery in the global economy. That's the first one. The second one, we are talking about the scarring effects because of the pandemic, which in turn also impact to the supply disruption, supply shock, and at the end, in turn to the inflation. Until now, we don't know yet which is inflation is a temporary or less temporary or even permanent. Nobody knows. But still, it comes to the third challenges, the normalization. Some countries already starting with the normalization, with the increasing of the policy rate, and the spillover coming to the emerging countries, coming to the countries we still facing with the growth issue. So that's the 3 challenges, and the last 4 challenges will be on the more frontiers issue, the fast pace of the digitalization, and also regarding the inclusion and also green economy and finance. I think basically, we need to have the policy strategy. Yeah. The policy strategy to address, and that's why we bring as a topical priority agenda in the G20 for the presidency of Indonesia. Yeah. That's the first. I think the precondition will be mass. And I think I totally agree that the vaccination, the acceleration of the vaccination, as well as the reopening of the priority sectors is a must for the countries starting to recover. For the Indonesia itself, number 2, I think admits that there is strong pressures, obstacles in the economy. I think our economy starting to move. We are closing to the release of the growth figures by the Bureau of Statistics 3 weeks from now. I'm quite sure that the Indonesian economy will be around 4.7% until, around 3.4% until 4%. Will be around 3.6% for the whole 2021. For the 2022, I think we based on the early indicators data. Agree that there is Omicron here with the country, but we are continue to move because the less restriction of the mobility, the same data like the retail sales, like the confidence of the consumer, of the economic agents still improving. So we are quite sure that Indonesian economy will be much better, will be around 4.7 until 5.5%. Will be around in the mid 5.1, 5.2%. Yesterday, I think today or yesterday, the fund already released the press communique, press release on the Indonesian assessment, Indonesian economy assessment. The testimony quite strong that Indonesia able to move for the 2020 growth much better than 2021. That's the good testimony, the good opinion coming from the reputational IOs for our country. So move the policy response, as you asking. Yeah. I think I believe that the implementation of the policy synergy between Bank Indonesia, with the government, with the Financial Stability Committee, even in the Bank Indonesia itself, under our Bank Indonesia policy mix, we call it as an integrated policy framework, is the key to facing the challenge. I think the framework of the, as you look in the slide, I think the framework of the policy mix of Bank Indonesia will direct the goal of the price stability and supporting the financial system stability through a combination of the measures, of the policies. Not only the interest rate, but also the liquidity, but also the capital flows, also the exchange rate, and the most important, with the macroprudential. We put macroprudential policy not only for the purpose of the financial stability only, but also to support the monetary stability, which is inflation, and also the financial system itself. So by combining the macroprudential policy, becoming larger room for us to use our instrument, our arsenal, to addressing our objective. That's the second one. The number 4 will be for 2022. Bank Indonesia will direct all the policy mix for the purpose of the maintaining stability while also supporting the momentum of growth. So we are changing the direction from the 2020 or 2021, all the measures for the growth, for the recovery. But for the 2022 understanding, there is some pressures coming from the global, even from the domestic. For the monetary stability, we will move more on the stability itself. But we still keep our macroprudential, our payment system policy, as well as the financial market deepening, and also the green and digital economy for the purpose for the growth. So this is like combination. We will consider the stability, but of course we also consider for the growth itself. So how we do that? I think we're starting with the policy mix under the monetary policy. We will starting with of course, the principle is we will conduct what we call as a preemptive policy. We will conduct a head the curve, a front loading. We will sequence all measures based on the exchange rate stability, the liquidity management, and also the interest rate policy. It depends on the development of the domestic inflation, development of the exchange rate, rupiah exchange rate. So this is data-dependent approach. But basically still, we consider there will be pressure for our objective, which is inflation and exchange rate stability. We will use our interest rate policy still low until there is indication the risk for the inflation. That's the time for us to change our stance. But if there is no risk, if there is no indication, I think we will still keep our interest rate as today. That's the first one. The second one, on the exchange rate, I think we will continue the stability with using our approach, the triple intervention. And also we consider how we manage the domestic external resilience, our balance of payments. Considering there will be a spillover coming from the normalization of the global monetary policy. That's one issue. So we will balance how we set the exchange rate stability with the flexibility in the yield curve. The first, I have to say, we want to have the differential of the yield attractive for the investors still coming to the country. So that's all. We believe our monetary mix policy combined with our accommodative policy from the macroprudential will continue to strengthen the recovery. Of course, the synergy with the government, synergy with the financial system stability will be must. We will put what you call as a precondition, necessary condition of the vaccination with the opening of the economic sectors in the first phase of our policy.
Okay.
And of course, the other policies will be coming following.
Okay.
I stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pak Dodi, for that quick overview. I will be asking a couple of more questions, but I have to move on to our next speaker first. Joining us via Zoom is Mr. Byung-Sik Jung. Mr. Byung-Sik, you have about 8 to 10 minutes. I know you've prepared some slides for us just to give us an overview. But as was also mentioned earlier a couple of times, the pandemic provides challenges for policy authorities on mitigating risk. I think that's the key focus right now, from increased debt and also accumulation, and also to support fiscal stimulus. So how do you think countries across the world could respond to the increased market volatility and also capital flow that we are witnessing right now and could be happening in the next few months throughout this year?
Okay, thank you, Ganya. Before I start, let me express these words. Apa kabar?
Kabar baik, Pak.
Kabar. Okay.
Thank
Before
you
I
so
start,
much for that.
Okay, before I start, I'd like to thank Indonesian Central Bank for preparing this precious international seminar and for the opportunity to give this presentation. I hope this presentation will provide insight into our discussion on debt and capital flow volatility to sustain the global economic recovery. Okay, next slide, please. First, I want to talk about why managing debt and capital flow volatility is important during these times. Next slide, please. Indeed, the global economy is recovering, as Dodi mentioned, but at an uneven pace across advanced and emerging economies. This slide shows how monetary policy normalization in major countries may hurt the emerging market economies under the uneven recovery pace. Monetary policy normalization in major countries raises international interest rates in the international financial market, which in turn increases local currency burdens and reduces fiscal space. Meanwhile, sudden capital flight due to interest rate gaps between advanced economies and emerging market economies may depreciate local currency, which in turn fuel inflation in emerging market economies. The bottom line is that if both debt and capital flow issues go unaddressed at this point, uneven growth will remain, hindering recovery throughout the global economy. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at debt issues and necessary responses. Debt issues among emerging economies are aggravating in both quantity and quality. As you can see in the upper chart, low and middle income countries have experienced sharp increase in external debts during their response to COVID-19. In the bottom chart, the 2020 debt to export ratio deteriorated from that of 2011. Next slide, please. Then, how should individual countries, international organizations, and the G20 address debt vulnerabilities among low-income countries? First, individual countries should make efforts to enhance fiscal sustainability. To the end, countries should boost economic growth and restructure fiscal spending. International organizations should continue monitoring debt sustainability. In fact, MDBs and IMF increased their support for low-income countries because of this, considering these critical and crisis situations. The G20 took largely two measures. One is DSSI to suspend low-income countries' debt. The second one is a common framework to restructure debts of low-income countries. Next slide, please. In addition, we are finding ways to support low-income countries by channeling the $650 billion worth of SDRs generally allocated last year. We have agreed on scaling up the IMF PRGT, Poverty Reduction Growth Trust, to reduce low-income country poverty. We have also decided to establish the RSD, Resilience and Sustainability Trust, last year to support mid-and long-term tasks, including climate change and pandemic response. Next slide, please. Furthermore, we are looking into ways to help low-income countries by making the most of MDB's resources through balance sheet optimization and capital adequacy frameworks. Moreover, country platforms participated by MDBs and private sector development partners of each country are in the pipeline to support low-income countries more effectively. Next slide, please. Now, let's move on to global economy and fiscal market condition related to the capital flows. Next slide, please. As you can see in the chart, the global economy is rebounding. However, uncertainty is increasing because of, as Dodi mentioned, spreading variants, supply chain bottlenecks, inflation, and possibilities of a macro policy normalization in major countries. The same goes for the financial market. Dow Jones and Nasdaq have been plunging since the start of this year, and Treasury yields are soaring due to the concern of normalization of monetary policy. Next slide, please. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, capital flow volatility has risen in emerging economies. In particular, emerging markets experienced the fast capital outflows. Capital flow volatility has soared since then as well. As you can see under your right-hand chart, the US tapering in 2014 and increased interest rate in 2015 shows strong correlation with emerging markets' capital outflows. Emerging markets should be prepared for this. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at responses by country. First, capital flows should be managed through proper macroeconomic policies and macroprudential measures. We can also use CFM, that is also MPMs, to reduce systematic financial risks arising from rapid capital inflows under the limited circumstance. Currency mismatch can be relieved to some extent by diversifying the currency in trade and finance. Next is responses at the regional level. Response capacity can become stronger by building regional financial safety nets. Great examples would be the CMIM, a multilateral currency swap arrangement among ASEAN plus 3 countries, and the ABMI, which aims to develop the Asian bond market. Lastly, at the global level, the IMF, the largest loaner, actually last resorter, should consider scaling up its financial resources in times of crisis. This year, we'll continue to discuss the IMF governance reform through the 16th General Review of Quarters. Another essential point is policy coordination between G20 members through the Framework Working Group and International Finance Architecture Working Groups under the G20. New transaction methods such as the CBDC, central bank digital currencies, should be underpinned by a set of global rules. Next slide, please. The strength, the growth momentum, it is imperative to managing sustainable debt and beef up resilience to capital flow volatility. The IMF, the IPA, International Finance Architecture Working Group, will be discussing diverse agendas for international financial architecture stability in the present year. The common framework to reduce debt-related issues, establish the RST to utilize the IMF's general SDR allocation, and IMF's general review of quarters, and the capital adequacy framework associated with the MDBs. In particular, we are going to discuss IMF institutional review regarding capital floors and CBDCs this year. A stable international finance architecture through G20 cooperation will secure recover stronger, recover together. I'd like to conclude by thanking again Indonesian Central Bank and asking the Indonesian presidency, G20 presidency, to provide your utmost support for these precious agendas. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you for that, Mr. Byung-sik. I'd like to dive deeper now on the topic of G20, especially when Indonesia is assumed the presidency for this year and is going to be held here in Indonesia this year. But before we do that, I'd like to continue with our last speaker. We have heard the side of the authorities, if I may say so, the monetary policies that have been implemented and sort of like the overview of what 2022 is going to hold and what the authorities, especially the monetary authorities, are going to go forward with in terms of policy decisions and policy decision making. But now I'd like to get the overview of the market as well on how you are seeing, the global financial market condition. What is the investor's perspective right now, and how are the challenges affecting us this year is going to affect the way the investor is going to respond. So maybe Pak Helmi would give us an overview of what is currently happening and how the investors are moving forward with the kind of issues and challenges that are present right now in this year, 2022. Pak Helmi.
Sure. Thank you, Kanya. Hello and good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is in good health. Before I begin, please allow me to express our gratitude to Bank Indonesia for giving us the honor to be here today to share our views in this prestigious event. So over the next 8 minutes, I'll try to add to our discussion by shedding more light on a common question that is often posed to us, which we adopted as a title in this presentation. So it's, as the economy recovers, will capital inflows recover too? As we all know, over the past 2 years throughout the pandemic, we faced an environment where portfolio investment inflows have been relatively weak. And this has come to us as a surprise to many of us, especially in light of the huge amount of liquidity creation pumped by global central banks. So in this regard, there are several points that I would be highlighting in the slides. First is that we'd like to highlight that, and this has been alluded to by the previous speaker, that the weakness in the portfolio capital inflows is not a phenomenon that is unique to just 1 or 2 countries. So over the past year and a half, Citi's platforms have seen global fund managers cutting their exposure to most emerging markets across the board, especially so in the local currency bond markets of these developing economies. The unwinding of EM risk was apparent in both quote-unquote real money fund managers. These are the fund managers that invest using funds from their own balance sheets and tend to have longer investment horizons, as well as the so-called hedge funds, which mostly invest using leveraged cash and tend to have shorter investment horizons. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So another point that we'd like to make is that the outflows that we've seen from emerging markets have materialized even though real interest rates in most emerging markets remain higher than real interest rates in developed markets. Indeed, as you can see in the slide, the gap between the two has narrowed. But if you look at Indonesia, which still has a positive real interest rate, Indonesia is possibly a testament that even emerging markets with positive interest rates are not immune to outflows from its local currency assets. Next slide, please. The third point we'd like to stress is the irony that all these outflows have been happening despite there being a lot of money creation among global central banks throughout the pandemic. So the next question that comes to mind is, all this liquidity creation, where has it headed to? Where did it go? Well, judging from the returns of various asset classes in 2021, I think we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence that a lot of liquidity went into the equity markets of developed countries. And perhaps to a lesser extent, investors also increased exposure to the commodities market. We can also see in this slide that there was negative returns on emerging market local currency assets, be it bonds or equities. And this tallies with our earlier observation that global investors tended to reduce EM positions last year. In our view, there are at least a couple of reasons why developed market equities were favored by global investors in the past year. First, last year we were in a globally inflationary environment with real interest rates turning negative. Thus, equities are seen as a better hedge against inflation relative to a fixed income. Secondly, given the occurrence of repeat COVID waves and lockdowns throughout the world, tech stocks were seen as a good hedge against the pandemic. And there is a fairly high degree of concentration of tech stocks in the US equity market. Meanwhile, as for why EMs, emerging markets, were not favored, there are also a number of reasons, and among them, from a growth perspective, EMs were viewed as lagging behind developed markets in terms of access to vaccinations. And this makes, the growth outlook for EM look dimmer. Secondly, the combination of a strong US economy and weak China economy is not viewed as a favorable condition for most emerging markets. When the US economy is strong, expectations of tighter monetary policy in the US emerges. And this is unfavorable for the capital accounts of emerging markets, especially emerging markets with current account deficit positions. Moreover, if we add to this a slowdown of the China economy, led by a deleveraging of the property sector, it becomes a double whammy for emerging markets. This is because expectations that the PBOC may tend to lean against yuan appreciation. And of course, the yuan is widely viewed as an anchor for other EM currencies more broadly. Next slide, and maybe skip this one and go to the last slide, please. So looking ahead, what's the outlook for global asset allocation in 2022? Indeed, the global macro backdrop will continue to evolve. Citi is expecting the Federal Reserve to hike by 4 times 25 basis points starting in March, and also to start shrinking its balance sheet beginning in June this year. And we show here that during past periods of Fed hiking cycles, US Treasury yields tended to rise until just before the last expected rate hike in the cycle. So in our view, this means that the 10-year US Treasury yields from the current levels, it means that it could still see some upside. Thus, in contrast to last year, to 2021, US real interest rates will likely be rising this year instead of declining. And as evidenced in the past couple of weeks, the move higher in US real interest rates could rattle asset classes that were most favored last year. That said, although risk-taking could unwind, Citi's global asset allocation team still sees US equities outperforming potentially outperforming other asset classes this year. Now, with regard to emerging markets, this year, China's economic growth is expected to slow further compared to last year. Thus, the Chinese yuan will not yet be able to serve as a strong anchor for emerging market currencies just yet. That said, we do see some light at the end of the tunnel. We think that global investors could begin to warm up to some emerging market fixed income assets this year, but on a currency hedged basis. However, such interest could be initially limited to EMs that have already seen a peak in their inflation rates, and also EMs whose respective policy rates have peaked or nearly peaked, thus are on the verge of cutting their policy rates. China falls into this basket, as well as a number of EMs in regions such as Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Now, lastly, what about emerging market Asia ex-China, where Indonesia sits in? We think it's possible that investor optimism later could extend to EM Asia ex-China, but perhaps it will be after we've seen inflation and interest rates in this region also reach their peaks. And with that, I'll end my presentation here. Thank you. Back to you, Kanya.
Okay, thank you, Pak Helmi, for that quick overview. I like that bit about, that light at the end of the tunnel, yeah, by Helmi. Thank you for that. But I'd like to pursue further since we are, I think one key factor or one key issue that was mentioned was about policy coordination. And I'd like to ask this question to Pak Dodi to highlight further, Indonesia's G20 presidency, in which the theme of this year is recover together and recover stronger. And I think with a heavy emphasis on together, yeah, Pak Dodi. So, but as was mentioned, earlier, and also during some of the G20 meetings, an issue is that many developed countries are changing their monetary policies without considering the impact it has in developing countries. So what can Indonesia do at the G20 to make sure such policies are considered together and in a more inclusive manner? Pak Dodi.
Thank you. I think this becoming the first priority agenda on the issue of the exit strategy. I think agree that every country doesn't want to be left behind.
Right.
They want to consider between the stability versus the growth. As long as there's stability there, they will focus more on the growth, but the other way around. I think the G20 agenda in the exit strategy will bring some understanding to all members what the risk and also what the benefit to be together.
Yeah.
No one left. I think the point that we want to say here is the exit should be well calibrated. It means that all the policies in the portfolio should be calculated, should be measured, which one must better fit with the condition.
Yeah.
Should be, again, well communicated, because need transparency and then understanding what the spillover effect from countries to countries, mostly from the major economies to the emerging countries. And the last one also well planned, because we have to use a sequencing, a time of the policies need to be taken. Of course, this is not a binding for the members to agree for one instrument. No one size fits all. No instrument fits for everybody.
Right.
This is country context, but giving some understanding, sharing the experience, what should be taken, and then also, again, the risk, the impact from any action from majors to the developing countries to the emerging countries should be taken in the flow. That's the point that we think that the recovery should be taken in the very short term. Together, no one left.
Okay, that's a very good point. Mr. Byung-sik, do you have any perspective on this? How optimistic are you that the G20 meetings this year that will be held in Indonesia can coordinate on that global level that you mentioned earlier, which is very significant in maintaining the recovery process going forward, Mr. Byung-sik?
Thank you for your questions. Actually, under the Indonesian presidency, the main topic is recovery together, recovery stronger. As Dodi mentioned, that the crucial point is that communications. Actually, under the framework working group, we conduct communication. That communication gives some signal or some rooms for emerging markets to prepare that kind of potential outflows. It's a very good point. But most important thing is that each country needed to secure stability, financial market stability through the deepening its financial markets. That effort should be continued regardless of the G20 levels of cooperation. And also, as Dodi mentioned, that the vaccination is very crucial thanks to the task force, health and finance ministers, the joint meeting is trying to make some financial facility as well as governance tools to contain a pandemic, upcoming frequent pandemics. That is also very important. Apart from that structural side, the crucial, the emergent task we had to do is expand the vaccination to achieve equal recovery. That is also very important. I expected that co-chairs Indonesia and Italy will do something to accelerate the vaccination to enjoy the same together recovery. That's a third point. Another point is that Indonesian presidency put a high priority on the digital currency issues. It's very important because considering we are living in digital and green society, therefore that initiative should be supported by members. I, as a co-chair of IPA working group, will do my best to implement Indonesian priorities in our discussion. That discussion would produce a fruitful result. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Byung-sik. And Pahami, last thoughts before I have to go to the floor for perspective and also comments on our discussion. What are the market expectations basically on the G20 this year, which will be held in Indonesia?
Thank you for the question, Kanya. Well, of course, there is expectations that optimism that through cooperation in the we could get through the pandemic quicker. But most of market, what's driving market dynamics mostly is what's happening with balance sheet tightening in the U.S. and potential rate hikes and inflation in the U.S. So that is more the dominant theme on what's driving markets lately.
Okay, very well. Now I'd like to move on to the floor. We would like to invite one of our guests or our participant attending this forum. We would like to invite Mr. Wempi Saputra, who is a special staff to the Minister of Finance of Indonesia. Mr. Wempi, to give your comments and maybe questions perhaps to our speakers.
Thank you, Kanya. Thank you also the opportunity for me to give a comments, and thank you for Governor Peri Warjo, Governor of Central Bank of Indonesia. I would like to add a safeguarding the growth momentum to strengthen the structural reform. In this case, Indonesia believes that reform are key to drive the longer term growth. We are always committed to promote reform, and the occurrence of pandemics even bolster our spirit of it. Reforms that we pursue are those that will unlock investment growth, boost productivity, and create jobs. In this case, our reform also directed towards the growth of new potential sectors such as digitalization and the green economy. To strengthen the safeguarding the growth momentum, I think we will focus on human capital and infrastructure investment, because this human capital development covers health, social security, and education aspects, is main part of the structural reform. The second part is that in the medium term, we are stepping up to strengthen our budget position and giving greater room for development spending, in this case on infrastructure, human capital, and institutional reform. Thus, continued efforts to strengthen spending effectiveness and efficiency and bolster our revenue collection capacity is always our top priority. I would like to pose two questions on this. Nowadays, inflation has been at its highest since 1990s. What does it mean for recovery? What does it mean for growth momentum? Is it here to last concerning the policy tightening, concerning the action taken by the Fed and the central banks? The second, what factors will drive recovery and longer-term growth? What role can the private sector play? Thank you very much.
Very well, thank you for that, Wempi Saputra. Mr. Wempi Saputra, there are two questions addressed to the panelists. Would you like to take this question, Dodi, before we go on to the next one?
Okay, thank you, Wempi. I think totally agree and noted that what's the meaning with high inflation for the growth, for the recovery momentum. I think basically we have to address what policy response. I think if we are talking inflation itself, I think we are talking the low growth, because there is a the factor of the impact of the policy to the growth itself. If we just looking only one policy itself, let's say we are just talking about the interest rate policy, by having a policy mix, I think that's a good for the countries have a large space room to choose. They have to address the inflation while also they're able to still supporting the momentum of the growth. So basically, the combination between what they have done by the central bank with the stability of the monetary policy, with the supporting growth from the macroprudential policy, from the payment system, we are able to balancing for the growth and with the stability.
Okay, very well. So let's go on to our next participant who would like to also give a comment is Mr. James P. Walsh, IMF Senior President Representative in Indonesia. Mr. Walsh, if you please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the BI for organizing this event. This is as Indonesia's presidency gets underway, it's great to see that I hope we can have more discussions like this where we're able to talk about the challenges faced by the global economy and global financial system. Dodi said that we released a press release today on our annual visit to Indonesia to talk about the economy, and I would reiterate that we feel very optimistic about Indonesia. We believe that growth is going to come back in 2022. It was quite strong in Q4, and we endorsed quite strongly Indonesia's policy framework, especially here at the BI. And we look forward to a situation where the Fed policy normalization and the challenges that the economy faces can continue to be managed under what we feel is a very strong framework. Debt remains quite under control at the public level and the external level, and capital flows and interest rates have remained quite stable. Mr. Jung, however, raised a point that I would like to build on, which is that we need to improve the management of capital flows, especially at a time when we are facing these challenges around the world. And he noted that the IMF did rethink our views over the last few years and published a report on this. And I would say that the IMF should continue to listen to countries like Korea and Indonesia that have gone farther than most countries in the world have, and really thinking through how macroeconomic management is changed by the need to think about financial stability and inflation and these other policies all at the same time. So I'm very happy to have this discussion and to hear from everybody here about these issues, because these are central banks that are really at the forefront of thinking on these issues. So my question would be here that, as Pak Helmi said, we have seen a lot of liquidity in global markets and a lot of movement into assets like technology assets that we used to think of as relatively high risk. And at the same time, US interest rates are rising and we're seeing very strong valuations in equity markets around the world. But if you look at consensus forecasts for inflation, there is an expectation that US inflation will begin to fall over the next few months, that it will peak in this quarter of the year and then begin to decline. So my question would be, how should we think about the world if US inflation does not decline? How do we think about that alternative scenario? So I guess for Pak Helmi, how should we think about that affecting the global economy? And for our colleagues from the official sector, how do you think Indonesia or Korea would be placed to handle that? And what sort of policies would you recommend in an environment of consistently higher US inflation?
Okay, very well. Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Walsh. And next we'd like to invite Mr. Yuben Parakweyes, Chief Economist at Nomura, who's also joining us online.
Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. Hello from Singapore, and thank you, BI and Perry and his team for having me here and the opportunity to comment and add to the discussion. I don't really have questions, but I just want to make 3 points and maybe be really keen to hear Pak Dodi's response with reference to BI's overall policy response. So first thing I'd say is, and this is something that a lot of emerging markets can learn from in terms of Indonesia's approach, and that is really what was mentioned before, that structural reforms have been a priority, which is really commendable, in the face of, this pandemic that we've had experienced in the last couple of years. So, BI has been very emphatic about financial sector reforms, financial market deepening, improving the policy transmission, even digitalization and payment systems. And I think this is increasingly getting a lot of traction among investors, that this is helping build resilience in Indonesia's financial markets. And then, of course, in the real sector, you've got the Omnibus Law and some fiscal reforms that have also been passed, which I think, again, in the context of the pandemic, is really very impressive, being able to pull that off and actually legislate it. Okay. My second point is outside of the structural reform, so that's being combined with counter-cyclical policies from BI and the MOF. And this is what BI's policy mix relates to. So it's a combination of instruments. And I must say, this is a really a source of exciting discussion and debate within my, even within us in Nomura, but also the broader foreign investor audience. And on the one side, markets are really giving this policy mix a lot of credit, because it has been effective. Bond yields did not really spike during the pandemic. The rupee has been very stable. And as we've seen from the announcement of BI last week regarding the RRR hikes, BI has been very proactive in terms of its goal of trying to normalize policy when you're facing with rising external risks, particularly with the Fed now back inflation. But on the other hand, I sense that there's still some question marks out there from certain camps, basically saying that this is a very sophisticated policy framework and kind of almost like very different from this classic Tinberg rule, one instrument and one goal. Right. Okay. So obviously, as Dodi has outlined, there's quite a bit of goals and instruments that BI is using. So I think the normalization that has already started is obviously going to be very gradual, because there is a step towards withdrawing some of the liquidity, but at the same time, other instruments are trying to support the recovery. So I guess the question that I'm posing to Dodi is kind of the communication for that might be a little bit more challenging, because it could potentially send some signals that BI is prioritizing stability, but at the same time, growth is also important. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you. We have Mr. Yuben Paracuellas, Chief Economist at Nomura, and also Mr. James P. Walsh, IMF Senior Resident Representative in Indonesia, giving their comments and also questions. But unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. We have to wrap things up. But I think we've highlighted some of the key issues and also the challenges that are going to be faced by the global economy. And there are a lot of expectations that the G20 can provide the solution moving forward. And also, we are still keeping that optimism that the recovery process during this year is going to go forward as planned, but also with cautionary, of course, in terms of the policy mix that has been displayed by some of the central banks around the world, was applauded by the market as well, by the investors as well. So we are hoping that going forward that, that optimism can still be kept until the end of the year. And also a special mention about vaccination rates and how the distribution of vaccines can be implemented equally, and that is going to be a game changer as well to support the global recovery process throughout this year. I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to conclude this session. Of course, I would like to thank you, our distinguished speakers that have joined us on this session, and as well to the participants for the questions and also the discussion. We also hope that today's seminar has been enlightening and can prepare us better to face 2022 and support the momentum for further recovery in the global economy. So thank you again, everyone. Stay safe and good afternoon. And I would like to hand back this event to our MC.
Terima kasih Ibu Kania. Terima kasih kepada para narasumber dan moderator. Kami persilakan untuk kembali ke tempat. Kita berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah untuk para narasumber dan moderator atas seminar yang sangat menarik ini. Baiklah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, telah kita saksikan bersama G20 Seminar International Series yang merupakan agenda pamungkas dari seluruh rangkaian acara pagi ini. Terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak Ibu sekalian yang telah mengikuti acara ini, baik secara luring maupun daring. Akhir kata, saya pamit undur diri. Sampai berjumpa di lain kesempatan. Wabillahi taufik wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om. Bagi Bapak Ibu yang berada bersama kami di Grand On Tamrin Ballroom, kami persilakan untuk meninggalkan tempat acara mulai dari baris pertama.
So, I guess this is just to assure identitas beliau. Bila beliau, maka disarankan presiden benar. Kayaknya gitu, saudara. Jadi ada dua.
Rese ya udah bayar, kasihan juga. Hah? Nah, pokoknya mungkin kalau kayak gini saya nggak mau debatin, kasihan. Ya kan jalankan
Terima
tugas.
kasih semuanya, selamat dan sukses.
Selamat.
Selamat.
Barokah.
Jadi kita berarti bersuara? Enggak ya? Bising dah. Ini mood loh.
Ganjil semua gue.
Bukan minta airnya yang genap.
Nah, nggak bisa. Semua mobil di rumah yang Avanza itu Avanza yang
Kenapa gak dimut?
Coba ya ini ganjil, nah siap kita aja.
Udah mau ada yang habis ya pakai 5 tahunan. Apa aja megang. Selamat dan sukses buat Bank Indonesia. Tambah 1,5 juta.
Saya coba lah. Berat juga nih.
Boleh Pak, mulai aja Pak. Nanti sampai pintu.
Wahida teko. Wahida teko. Wahida. Enggak Wahida.
Apa? Iya, oh itu. Kami ya. Ya, bukan kan suaminya yang ngomong sama aku. Enggak, serius. Ya itu.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah sehat. Ini tahu. Ini suka dengan Pak As.